the secret oaths, and the secret proceedings.
I think a new world order is emerging.
An inside job? How dare you? How dare you?
To create, so to say, mass-produced models of human beings arranged in some kind of a scientific caste system.
We shall go on to the end. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall never surrender.
Good day, everybody. This is UCY.tv. Sorry about the little delay there. I'm your host, Walter Hendricks, coming to you from the Netherlands. It's 4 p.m., the 25th of June 2016. Welcome everybody. How are you all doing? So I just tweeted that we are live. Solvinur. Tweet Solvinur. So go and retweet that shizzle if you like. Now live on reallibertymedia.com, channel 6, the Solvinur event, Brave New World Part 2, also at ucy.tv. Check it out. The home station, ucy.tv at ucy.tv. Good morning in the United States, 10 a.m. Eastern Standard. So I have a cup of tea here. Cracker, welcome, buddy. Yeah, the people, I'm not quite sure if they were from the Watchtower, but they gave me two booklets even, about with questions. What was life? Yeah, we have a strange word for that actually. I'll have to write this down and come back on it a bit later. Hold on. Yes. Everybody in the chat, welcome. At ucy.tv you will find a possibility to go to the chat room. It's a platform where people share information, give opinions, and things like that. Captain Gringo is there. Hi, buddy. Cracker. What's up with that number behind you? Is that just random, Cracker, or does it have a significance? Hans is there. Hopper, hey buddy. And Otto is there, and Shirley is there, and Wananon. Welcome. How you doing, guys? So, we're going to be doing Brave New World, and it's part 2, and it's accidentally also chapter 2, because we had to end the show at exactly where chapter 1 ended. So, let me light my cigarette, guys. Now, all over the news, of course, which you know I normally don't follow, but in this case it was kind of hard to miss, is the British people voting to exit the European Union. And I heard Cameron speak about it, and he said that he was going to go to the European Commission, and there was something, an article or an act, whatever he had to do, something with the number 50, and that would set in motion the exit of Britain from the European Union. And I was like, I don't understand. How did this happen? You know, I was like, oh, that would be a shock if they left. It doesn't jive with the homogenization, I think is the English word for it. It doesn't jive with the, and that I know for certain, the sovereign destruction program that has been started from Downing Street 10, because it is the same address as the Royal Institute of International Affairs, which is tied to the Milner Group and Cecil Rhodes. And so these are organizations that strive to destroy the sovereignty of nations. So, you know, the British people said no, and now this procedure has been set in motion. And also I read that, and I'm not sure how the legal system works there, but that Parliament still has its say on it. So we'll have to see what's going on. Technically speaking, I think they are still in the European Union at the moment, because, you know, this procedure has to be gone through. So if, for instance, a major war would break out, I can imagine Parliament, the British government saying, well, we'll have to wait a little bit because we're going to have to deal with this crisis or whatever, you know. I don't know what's going to happen, but it seems so strange, right? It seems so strange because when we here in the Netherlands voted that no, we don't want a European Union constitution, and we said no, right? And they, you know, tried to propagandize us a little bit more, and they tried it again, and we said no, we don't want it, no. And what did they do? They do it anyway. right? So these referendum, as it was here in the Netherlands anyway, they don't care. Not one bit. It was like 60% against. So, I just don't know what to think of it all. And one thing I was talking about with Otto in the chat room earlier is that we know. I say we know. I shouldn't say that. I suspect, and I know that many of you will agree with me because you've done your research on this field. Unfortunately, I have not, although I can see how it would work. Is that the bankers are in control of a lot of what's going on politically also, right? And so this is a political move, I would say. At first glance, I think it's even as big as a move as the falling of the wall in Berlin. However, London City, which is like the economic center, where they set the price of gold every morning, yeah, it's not even part of the United Kingdom, let alone part of the European Union. It's a separate state in itself. So I'm not sure if they play a role, and if they do, what's the deal here? What's their goal? I've heard some people claim that the goal is to sack the rest of Europe economically and keep Britain afloat. Yeah, a bit sinister. I've heard people say, well, the European Union might break up and there might be like a Northern European Union type like economic community being put in its place, and a South European likewise economic unity. All of these different things. I called the Dutch government and asked them if there was a possibility of a referendum for the Dutch to get out of the European Union. All right, so I don't know how this referendum came about in Britain, but in the Netherlands it is so that a new law has to be proposed before a referendum can be made. Right? So a referendum requires a new law to be put forth, otherwise there's nothing to be held a referendum about. So then I tried to call the PVV. Apparently I was calling at the wrong time because nobody picked up. I wanted to ask them, and I just called the press center, if they were gonna ask who you are. Well, I'm an independent researcher from UCY.tv, so, consider myself a part of the press. Anyway, they didn't pick up, but I was gonna ask them if they were going to put forth what we call in Holland, een wetsvoorstel, and that means that you write a bunch of words on a piece of paper and you hand that to the I'm not sure if it's the first or the second chamber here, but you hand it to them and they have to read it and you have to vote on it. It's kind of an offer that you make, right? So I was going to ask them if they were going to make such a proposal, but haven't had luck so far contacting them. I think a lot of people in the Netherlands want to step out of the European Union. and they want the borders closed. That's the sentiment that I get from the people that I work with. And another thing about this referendum in Britain, it was like 51% for and 49% against. Something like that. All right, so a very small difference. So first of all, these votings can be rigged. Excuse me. And second of all, since when have they ever granted, like I said, they didn't do it in the Netherlands. Since when have they ever granted the majority of the people their wish? Right, so that's also something strange. All right. So I guess that's enough about that. All right, Cracker, to come back on that watchtower thing. There were some people here, and they gave me this booklet, and it says in Dutch, is het leven geschapen? Is het leven means is life, leven, life. You can hear the etymological tie there, right? And maybe you can even hear the more etymological tie of the word geschapen. It's a Dutch word, and it means, I would translate it into English as created, but it's not really a good translation, because if I translate created back into Dutch, you can just say creatie. And that it sounds exactly the same as in English, right? Almost exactly the same. But if I were to translate literally the word geschapen into English, you would say made sheep-like, right? The word schaap is in there, which means sheep. And I found that kind of odd, right? They were nice people anyway, but it's hard to talk to these people. All right, so let's see. Juana Taco has joined in the chat room. Welcome, Juana. And Dale, I see also. How you doing, guys? Let's dive into chapter 2 here. This is not going to be easy. This English is tough. I think when I did read it in the past, it was in Dutch. All right. So, chapter 2. Mr. Foster was left in the decanting room. The DHC and his students stepped into the nearest lift and were carried up to the 5th floor. Infant nurseries, neo-Pavlovian conditioning rooms, announced the notice board. Neo-Pavlovian, right? So it's not like the techniques that were used in the 1920s, for instance, to influence the masses of people. In their behavior, since we're talking about Pavlov, right? Neo-Pavlovian conditioning rooms. It's not like those methods haven't been improved on, you see. Getting better and better at it. The director opened the door. They were in a large, bare room, very bright and sunny. for the whole of the southern wall was a single window. Half a dozen nurses, trousered and jacketed in the regulation white viscose linen uniform, their hair aseptically hidden under white caps, were engaged in setting out bowls of roses in a long row across the floor. Big bowls packed tight with blossom, thousands of petals, ripe brown and silkily smooth, like the cheeks of innumerable little cherubs, buds of cherubs, in that bright light, not exclusively pink and Aryan, but also luminously Chinese, also Mexican, also apoplectic, with too much blowing of celestial trumpets, also pale as death, pale with the posthumous whiteness of marble. The nurses stiffened to attention as the DHC came in. "Set out the books," he said curtly. In silence the nurses obeyed his command. Between the rows bowels the books were duly set out, a row of nursery quartos opened invitingly, each at some gaily colored image of beast or fish or bird. "Now bring the children." They hurried out of the room and returned in a minute or two, each pushing a kind of tall, dumbwaiter-laden, on all its 4 wire-netted shelves, with 8-month-old babies, exactly alike. A Bokanovsky group, it was evident. And all, since their castle was Delta, dressed in khaki. Put them down on the floor. The infants were unloaded. "Now turn them so that they can see the flowers and the books." Turned, the babies at once fell silent, then began to crawl towards those clusters of sleek colors, those shapes so gay and brilliant on the white pages. As they approached, the sun came out of a momentary eclipse behind a cloud. The roses flamed up as though with a sudden passion from within. A new and profound significance seemed to suffuse the shining pages of the books. From the ranks of the crawling babies came little squeals of excitement, gurgles and twitterings of pleasure. The director rubbed his hands. "Excellent," he said. "It might also have been done on purpose." The swiftest crawlers were already at their goal. Small hands reached out uncertainly, touched, grasped, unpetaling the transfigured roses, crumpling the illuminated pages of the books. The director waited until all were happily busy. Then, "Watch carefully," he said, and, lifting his hand, he gave the signal. The head nurse, who was standing by a switchboard at the other end of the room, pressed down a lever. There was a violent explosion. Shriller and ever shriller, a siren shrieked. Alarm bells maddeningly sounded. The children started, screamed. Their faces were distorted with terror. "And now," the director shouted, for the noise was deafening, "now we proceed to rub in the lesson with a mild electric shock." He waved his hand again, and the head nurse pressed the second lever. The screaming of the baby suddenly changed its tone. There was something desperate, almost insane, about the sharp, spasmodic yelps to which they now gave utterance. Their little bodies twitched and stiffened. Their limbs moved jerkily as if to tug of unseen wires. "We can electrify the whole strip of floor," bawled the director in explanation. "But that's enough," he signaled to the nurse. The explosions ceased. The bell stopped ringing. The shriek of the siren died down from tone to tone into silence. The stiffly twitching bodies relaxed, and what had become the sob of yelps of infants, maniacs, broadened out once more into a normal howl of ordinary terror. "Offer them the flowers and books again." The nurses obeyed, but at the approach of the roses, at the mere sight of those gaily colored images of Pussy and Cock-a-doodle-doo and Baba Black, Sheep, the infants shrank away in horror. The volume of their howling suddenly increased. "Observe," said the director triumphantly. "Observe." Ja. This is what's called conditioning, right? Books and loud noises, flowers and electric shocks. Already in the infant mind, these couples were compromisingly linked. And after 200 repetitions of the same or similar lesson would be wedded indissolubly. Can't dissolve them. Jesus Christ, why so difficult words? What man has joined, nature is powerless to put asunder. They'll grow up with what the psychologists used to call an instinctive hatred of books and flowers, reflexes unalterably conditioned. They'll be safe from books and botany all their lives. The director turned to his nurses. Take them away again. Still yelling, the khaki babies were loaded off their dumb waiters and wheeled out. Loaded on. Leaving behind them the smell of sour milk and most welcome silence. One of the students held up his hand, and though he could see quite well why you couldn't have lower caste people wasting the community's time over books, and that there was always the risk of their reading something which might undesirably decondition one of their reflexes, yet, well, he couldn't understand about the flowers. Why go to the trouble of making it psychologically impossible for deltas to like flowers? Patiently, the DHC explained. If the children were made to scream at the sight of a rose, that was on grounds of high economic policy. Not so very long ago, a century or thereabouts, gammas, deltas, even epsilons had been conditioned to like flowers, flowers in particular, and wild nature in general. The idea was to make them want to be going out into the country at every available opportunity, and so compel them to consume transport. Ah, didn't they consume transport? Asked the student. Quite a lot, the DHC replied, but nothing else. Primroses and landscape, he pointed out, have one grave defect. They are gratuitous. A love of nature keeps no factories busy. It was decided to abolish the love of nature, at any rate among the lower classes. To abolish the love of nature, but not the tendency to consume transport. For of course it was essential that they should keep on going to the country, even though they hated it. The problem was to find an economically sounder reason for consuming transport than a mere affection for primroses and landscapes. It was duly found. We conditioned the masses to hate the country, concluded the director, but simultaneously we conditioned them to love all country sports. At the same time, we see to it that all country sports shall attain the use of elaborate apparatus, so that they consume manufactured articles as well as transport, hence those electric shocks. I see, said the student, and was silent, lost in admiration. Hold on, guys. Yeah. Got a link to that, Otto? I'm just jumping in on the chat here. That I want to see also. Blah blah. Yeah, if you have any questions, you can try and grab my attention in the chat room there, or you can call Skype. Start up your Skype and contact me at Solvinur, Solvinur. All right. There was a silence. It's actually what it says in the book, guys. There was a silence. Then, clearing his throat, once upon a time, the director began, while our fort was still on Earth, there was a little boy called Reuben Rabinovich. Reuben was the child of Polish-speaking parents. The director interrupted himself. You know what Polish is, I suppose? A dead language. Like French and German, added another student, obviously showing off his learning. And parent? Questioned the DHC. There was an uneasy silence. Several of the boys blushed. They had not yet learned to draw the significant, but often very fine distinction between smut and pure science. One at last had the courage to raise a hand. Human beings used to be... He hesitated. The blood rushed to his cheeks. Well, they used to be viviparous. Quite right, the director nodded approvingly. And when the babies were decanted? Born, came the correction. Well, then they were the parents. I mean, not the babies, of course, the other ones. The poor boy was overwhelmed with confusion. In brief, the director summed up, the parents were the father and the mother. The smut that was really science fell with a crush into the boy's eye-avoiding silence. Mother? He repeated loudly, rubbing in the science and leaning back in his chair. These, he said gravely, are unpleasant facts. I know it, but then most historical facts are unpleasant. He returned to little Reuben, the little Reuben, in whose room, one evening, by an oversight, his father and mother, crash, crash, happened to leave the radio turned on. For you must remember that in those days of gross viviparous reproduction, children were always brought up by their parents and not in state conditioning centers. While the child was asleep, a broadcast program from London suddenly started to come through, and the next morning, to the astonishment of his crash, the more daring of the boys ventured to grin at one another, little Reuben woke up, one repeating word for word a long lecture by that curious old writer, one of the very few whose works have been permitted to come down to us, George Bernard Shaw, who was speaking according to a well-authenticated tradition about his own genius. Yeah, well, since this is one of Huxley's books, we should probably Google or put in the brain this George Bernard Shaw. But I'm not going to do that. Just keep going. To little Reuben's wink and snigger, this lecture was, of course, perfectly incomprehensible, and, imagining that their child had suddenly gone mad, they sent for a doctor. He, fortunately, understood English, recognized the discourse as that which Shaw had broadcasted the previous evening, realized the significance of what had happened, and sent a letter to the medical press about it. The principle of sleep teaching, or hypnopedia, had been discovered. The DHC made an impressive pause. The principle had been discovered, but many years were to elapse before that principle was usefully applied. The case of little Reuben occurred only 23 years after our Ford's first T model was put on the market. Here the director made a sign of the T on his stomach, and all the students reverently followed suit. And yet, furiously the students scribbled, "Hypnopedia, first used officially in AF 214. Why not before? 2 reasons. A. These early experimenters, the DHC was saying, were on the wrong track. They thought that hypnopedia could be made into an instrument of intellectual education. Hold on, guys. Blah, blah. Oh, okay. Just give me a link. I don't see it. Let me scroll up. No. Ah, there it is. Yes. Thanks, buddy. I see. All right. Very good. Thanks. Nice. Check that out. Sorry about the interruption, guys. Chup. Yeah. Where were we? They were on the wrong track. They thought that Hypnopedia could be made an instrument of intellectual education. The small boy asleep on his right side, the right arm struck out, the right hand hanging limp over the edge of the bed. Through a round grating in the side of a box a voice speaks softly. The Nile is the longest river in Africa and the second in length of all rivers of the globe. Although falling short of the length of the Mississippi, Missouri, the Nile is at the head of all rivers as regards the length of its basin, which extends through 35 degrees of latitude. At breakfast the next morning, Tommy, someone says, "Do you know which is the longest river in Africa?" A shaking of the head. "But don't you remember something that begins, The Nile is the longest river in Africa and the second in length of all the rivers of the globe." The words came rushing out, although falling short of... Well now, which is the longest river in Africa? The eyes are blank. I don't know. But the Nile, Tommy. The Nile is the longest river in Africa and second... Then which river is the longest, Tommy? Tommy burst into tears. "I don't know," he howls. That howl, the director made it plain, discouraged the earliest investigators. The experiments were abandoned. No further attempts were made to teach children the length of the Nile in their sleep. Quite rightly, you can't learn a science unless you know what it's all about. Whereas if they'd only started on moral education, said the director, leading the way towards the door. The students followed him, desperately scribbling as they walked, and all the way up into the lift. Moral education, which ought never in any circumstances to be rational. "Silence, silence," whispered a loudspeaker as they stepped out the 14th floor. Silence. The trumpet mouths indefatigably repeated at intervals down every corridor. The students and even the director himself rose automatically to the tips of their toes. They were alphas, of course, but even alphas had been well conditioned. Silence. All the air of the 14th floor was sibilant with the categorical imperative. Categorical imperative. That's a grammatical term, right? If I understand this correctly. "50 yards of tiptoeing brought them to a door which the director cautiously opened. They stepped over the threshold into the twilight of a shuttered dormitory. 80 cots stood in a row against the wall. There was the sound of light, regular breathing and a continuous murmur, as of very faint voices remotely whispering. A nurse rose as they entered and came to attention before the director. "What's the lesson this afternoon?" he asked. "We had elementary sex for the first 40 minutes," she answered, "but now it switched over to elementary class consciousness." The director walked slowly down the long line of cots, rosy and relaxed with sleep. 80 little boys and girls lay softly breathing. There was a whisper under every pillow. The DHC halted and, bending over one of the little beds, listened attentively. "Elementary class consciousness, did you say? Let's have it repeated a little louder by the trumpet." At the end of the room, a loudspeaker projected from the wall. The director walked up to it and pressed a switch. "All wear green," said a soft but distinct voice, beginning in the middle of a sentence. "And Delta children wear khaki." "Oh no, I don't want to play with Delta children. And Epsilons are still worse. They are too stupid to be able to read or write. Besides, they wear black, which is such a beastly color. I'm so glad I'm a beta." There was a pause. Then the voice began again. "Alpha children wear gray. They work much harder than we do, because they are so frightfully clever. I'm really awfully glad I'm a beta, because I don't work so hard. And then we are much better than the gammas and deltas. Gammas are stupid. They all wear green. And delta children wear khaki. Oh no, I don't want to play with delta children. And epsilons are still worse. They are too stupid to be able..." The director pushed back the switch. The voice was silent. Only its thin ghost continued to mutter from beneath the 80 pillows. "They'll have that repeated 40 or 50 times before they wake, then again on Thursday, and again on Saturday. 120 times 3 times a week for 30 months, after which they go on to a more advanced lesson." Roses and electric shocks, the khaki of deltas and the whiff of what? It says ASAF question mark TIDA, so I don't know, it must be something like a misprint or something. Wedded wedded indissolubly before the child can speak. But wordless conditioning is crude and wholesale, cannot bring home the finer distinctions, cannot inculcate the more complex courses of behavior. For that there must be words, but words without reason, in brief, hypnopedia. The greatest moralizing and socializing force of all time. The students took it down in their little books, straight from the horse's mouth. Once more the director touched the switch. "So frightfully clever," the soft, insinuating, indefatigable voice was saying. "I'm really awfully glad I'm a beta, because..." Not so much like drops of water, though water, it is true, can wear holes in the hardest granite, rather drops of liquid, sealing wax, drops that adhere, encrust, incorporate themselves with what they fall on, till finally the rock is all one scarlet blob. Till at last the child's mind in these suggestions, and the sum of the suggestions is the child's mind. And not the child's mind only, the adult's mind too, all his life long. The mind that judges and desires and decides, made up of those suggestions. But all these suggestions are our suggestions, the director almost shouted in his triumph. Suggestions from the state. He banged his nearest table. It therefore follows. A noise made him turn round. "Oh, Ford," he said in another tone, "I've gone and woke the children." That was the end of chapter 2. Hey Grump, how you doing, buddy? Welcome. Matty Clues. Were you already there? If not, welcome. So, let's move on to chapter 3. I'm gonna have my cigarette here. Outside, in the garden, it was playtime. Naked in the warm June sunshine, 600 or 700 little boys and girls were running with shrill yells over the lawn, or playing ball games, or squatting silently in twos and threes among the flowering shrubs. The roses were in bloom. 2 nightingales soliloquized, something like that, soliloquized, in the boscage. Jesus Christ. A cuckoo was just going out of tune among the lime trees. The air was drowsy with the murmur of bees and helicopters. The director and his students stood for a short time watching a game of centrifugal bumble puppy. 20 children were grouped in a circle round a chrome steel tower. A ball thrown up so as to land on the platform at the top of the tower rolled down into the interior, fell on a rapidly revolving disc, was hurled through one or other of the numerous apertures pierced in the cylindrical casing, and had to be caught. Strange, mused the director as they turned away. Strange to think that even in our Ford's day most games were played without more apparatus than a ball or two and a few sticks, and perhaps a bit of netting. Imagine the folly of allowing people to play elaborate games which do nothing whatever to increase consumption. It's madness. Nowadays, the controllers won't approve of any new game unless it can be shown that it requires at least as much apparatus as the most complicated of existing games. He interrupted himself. That's a charming little group, he said, pointing. In a little grassy bay between tall clumps of Mediterranean heather, 2 children, a little boy of about 7 and a little girl who might have been a year older, were playing very gravely and with all the focused attention of scientists intent on a labor of discovery, a rudimentary sexual game. Charming, charming, the DHC repeated sentimentally. Charming, the boys politely agreed. But their smile was rather patronizing. They had put aside similar childish amusements too recently to be able to watch them now without a touch of contempt. Charming, but it was just a pair of kids fooling about. That was all, just kids. I always think, the director was continuing in the same rather maudlin tone, when he was interrupted by a loud booing. From a neighboring shrubbery emerged the nurse, leading by the hand a small boy, who howled as he went. An anxious-looking girl trotted at her heels. "What's the matter?" asked the director. The nurse shrugged her shoulders. "Nothing much," she answered. "It's just that this little boy seems rather reluctant to join in the ordinary erotic play. I'd noticed it for once or twice before, and now again today. He started yelling just now." "Honestly," put in the anxious-looking little girl, "I didn't mean to hurt him or anything, honestly." "Of course you didn't, dear," said the nurse reassuringly. "And so," she went on, turning back to the director, "I'm taking him in to see the assistant superintendent of psychology, just to see if anything's at all abnormal." "Quite right," said the director. "Take him in. You stay here, little girl," he added, as the nurse moved away with her still howling charge. "What's your name?" "Polly Trotsky." "And a very good name, too," said the director. "Run away now and see if you can find some other boy to play with." The child scampered off into the bushes and was lost to sight. "Exquisite little creature," said the director, looking after her. Then, turning to his students, "What I'm going to tell you now," he said, "may sound incredible, but then, when you're not accustomed to history, most facts about the past do sound incredible." He let out the amazing truth. For a very long period before the time of our Ford, and even for some generations afterwards, erotic play between children had been regarded as abnormal. There was a roar of laughter, and not only abnormal, actually immoral, and had therefore been rigorously suppressed. A look of astonished incredulity appeared on the faces of his listeners. Poor little kids not allowed to amuse themselves? They could not believe it. Even adolescents, the DHC was saying, even adolescents like yourself. Not possible. Barring a little surreptitious autoerotism and homosexuality, absolutely nothing. Nothing? In most cases, till they were over 20 years old. 20 years old? Echoed the students in a chorus of loud disbelief. 20, the director repeated. I told you that you'd find it incredible. But what happened? They asked. What were the results? The results were terrible. A deep resonant voice broke startlingly into the dialogue. They looked around. On the fringe of the little group stood a stranger, a man of middle height, black-haired, with a hooked nose, full red lips, eyes very piercing and dark. Terrible, he repeated. The DHC had at that moment sat down on one of the steel and rubber benches conveniently scattered through the gardens. But at the sight of the stranger, he sprang to his feet and darted forward, his hand outstretched, smiling with all his teeth. effusive. Controller, what an unexpected pleasure. Boys, what are you thinking of? This is the controller. This is his fourth ship, Mustafa Mond. In the 4,000 rooms of the center, the 4,000 electric clock simultaneously struck 4. Discarnate voices called from the trumpet mouths. Main day shift of duty. Second day shift takeover. Main day shift off. In the lift, on their way up to the changing rooms, Henry Foster and the assistant director of Predestination rather pointedly turned their backs on Bernard Marx from the Psychology Bureau, averted themselves from that unsavory reputation. The faint hum and rattle of machinery still stirred the crimson air in the embryo store. Shifts might come and go. One lupus-colored face give place to another. Majestically and forever the conveyors crept forward with their load of future men and women. Lelina Crown walked briskly towards the door. His fourth ship, Mustafa Mond. The eyes of the saluting students almost popped out of their heads. Mustafa Mond, the resident controller for Western Europe, one of the 10 world controllers. One of the 10, and he sat down on the bench with the DHC. He was going to stay. Yes, and actually talk to them, straight from the horse's mouth. 2 shrimp-brown children emerged from a neighboring shrubbery, stared at them for a moment with large, astonished eyes, then returned to their amusement among the leaves. "You all remember," said the controller, in his strong, deep voice, "you all remember, I suppose, that beautiful and inspired saying of our Fords. History is bunk. History," he repeated slowly, "is bunk." He waved his hand, and it was as though, with an invisible feather whisk, he had brushed away a little dust, and the dust was Harappa, was Ur of the Chaldees, some spider webs, and there were Thebes and Babylon and Kronos. Actually, it doesn't say Kronos. And Mycenae. Harappa is old civilization. Whisk. And where was Odysseus? Where was Job? Where were Jupiter and Gautama and Jesus? Whisk. And those specks of antique dirt called Athens and Rome, Jerusalem and the Middle Kingdom all were gone. Whisk. The place where Italy had been was empty. Whisk the cathedrals. King Lear and the thoughts of Pascal. Whisk passion. Whisk requiem and symphony. Whisk. "Going to the Feelies this evening, Henry?" inquired the assistant predestinator. "I hear the new one at Alhambra is first rate. There's a love scene on the bearskin rug. They say it's marvelous. Every hair of the bear reproduced. The most amazing tactual effects." That's why you're taught no history, the controller was saying. But now the time has come. The DHC looked at him nervously. There were those strange rumors of old forbidden books hidden in a safe in the controller's study. Bibles, poetry, Ford knew what. Mustafa Mond intercepted his anxious glance and the corners of his red lips twitched ironically. "It's all right, Director," he said in a tone of faint derision. "I won't corrupt them." The DHC was overwhelmed with confusion. Those who feel themselves despised do well to look despising. The smell on Bernard Mark's face was contemptuous. Every hair on the bear indeed. "I shall make a point of going," said Henry Foster. Mustafa Mond leaned forward, shook a finger at him. "Just try to realize it," he said, and the voice sent a strange thrill quivering along their diaphragms. Phew. Try to realize what it was like to have a viviparous mother. That smutty word again, but none of them dreamed this time of smiling. Try to imagine what living with one's family meant. They tried, but obviously without the smallest success. And do you know what a home was? They shook their heads. From her dim crimson cellar, Lelina Crown shot up 17 stories, turned to the right as she stepped out of the left, walked down the long corridor, and, opening the door marked "Girls' Dressing Room," plunged into a deafening chaos of arms and bosoms and underclothing. Torrents of hot water were splashing into or gurgling out of 100 baths. Rumbling and hissing, 80 vibro vacuum massage machines were simultaneously kneading and sucking the firm and sunburned flesh of 80 superb female specimens. Everyone was talking at the top of their voice. A synthetic music machine was warbling out a super cornet solo. "Hello, Fanny," said Lelina to the young woman who had the pegs and locker next to hers. Fanny worked in the bottling room, and her surname was also Crown. But as the 2,000 million inhabitants of the planet had only 10,000 names between them, the coincidence was not particularly surprising. Lenina, the names this author is using, right? Lenina. Trotsky, right? Lenina pulled at her zippers, downwards on the jacket, downwards with a double-handed gesture at the two that held trousers, downwards again to loosen her undergarment. Still wearing her shoes and stockings, she walked off towards the bathrooms. I need to roll a new sickie here. Home. Home, a few small rooms, stiflingly over-inhabited by a man, by a periodically teeming woman, by a rabble of boys and girls of all ages. No air, no space. An under-sterilized prison, darkness, disease and smells. The controller's evocation was so vivid that one of the boys, more sensitive than the rest, turned pale at the mere description and was on the point of being sick. Lenina got out of the bath, toweled herself dry, took hold of a long flexible tube plugged into the wall, presented the nozzle to her breast, as though she meant to commit suicide, pressed down the trigger. A blast of warmed air dusted her with the finest talcum powder. 8 different scents and eau de cologne were laid on in little taps over the wash basin. She turned on the third from the left, dabbed herself with chypre, and, carrying her shoes and stockings in her hand, went out to see if one of the 2 vibro vacuum machines were free. And home was as squalid physically as physically. What the heck is this? It's kind of strange sentence. And then it continues the next sentence with physically. Physically, it was a rabbit hole, a midden, hot with frictions of tightly packed life, reeking with emotion. What suffocating intimacies, what dangerous, insane, obscene relationships between the members of the family group. Maniacally, right. Maniacally. A maniac is someone who's always in your face at the poker table. That's a maniac. You get them sometimes. It's nice to do also sometimes. Nice to be the maniac. It can be healthy. At the poker table, that is. Blah blah. Maniacally, the mother brooded over her children. Her children. Brooded over them like a cat over its kitten. But a cat that could talk, a cat that could say, my baby, over and over again. My baby, and oh, at my breast these little hands, the hunger and that unspeakable agonizing pleasure. Till at last my baby sleeps. My baby sleeps with a bubble of white milk at the corner of his mouth. My little baby sleeps. Yes, said Mustafa Mond, nodding his head. You may well shudder. Who are you going out with tonight? Lenina asked, returning from the vibrovac like a pearl illuminated from within, pinkly glowing. Nobody. Lenina raised her eyebrows in astonishment. I've been feeling rather out of sorts lately, Fanny explained. Dr. Wells advised me to have a pregnancy substitute. But my dear, you're only 19. The first pregnancy substitute isn't compulsory till 21. I know, dear, but some people are better if they begin earlier. Dr. Wells told me that brunettes with wide pelvises like me ought to have their first pregnancy substitute at 17. So I'm really 2 years late, not 2 years early. She opened the door of her locker and pointed to the row of boxes and labeled vials on the upper shelf. Syrup of Corpus luteum. Lenina read the names aloud. Overin. Guaranteed fresh, not to be used after August 1st, AF, that's Anno Ford, 632. Mammary gland, that's not memory, but it's MAMMARY, mammary, I don't know. Mammary gland extract, to be taken 3 times daily, before meals, with a little water. Placentin, 5 cc, to be injected intravenously every 3rd day. Ugh, Lenina shuddered. How I loathe intravenals, don't you? Yes, but when they do one good... Fanny was a particularly sensible girl. Our Ford, or our Freud, as for some inscrutable reason, has chosen to call himself, whenever he spoke of psychological matters, our Freud, had been the first to reveal the appealing dangers of family life. The world was full of fathers, was therefore full of misery, full of mothers, therefore of every kind of perversion, from sadism to chastity, full of brothers, sisters, uncles, aunts, full of madness and suicide. And yet, among the savages of Samoa, in a certain island off the coast of New Guinea, the tropical sunshine lay like warm honey on the naked bodies of the children, tumbling promiscuously among the hibiscus blossoms. Home was in any one of 20 palm-thatched houses. In the Trobriand's. In the Trobriand's conception was the work of ancestral ghosts. Nobody had ever heard of a father. Extremes, said the controller, meet, for the good reason that they were made to meet. Dr. Wells says that a 3-month pregnancy substitute now will make all the difference to my health for the next 3 or 4 years. Well, I hope he's right, said Lenina. But, Fanny, do you really mean to say that for the next 3 months you're not supposed to do? Oh no, dear, only for a week or 2, that's all. I shall spend the evening at the club playing musical bridge. I suppose you're going out? Lenina nodded. Who with? Henry Foster. Again? Fanny's kind, rather moon-like face took on an incongruous expression of pained and disapproving astonishment. Do you mean to tell me you're still going out with Henry Foster? Mothers and fathers, brothers and sisters. But there were also husbands, wives, lovers. There were also monogamy and romance. Though you probably don't know what those are, said Mustafa Mond. They shook their heads. Family, monogamy, romance, everywhere exclusiveness, a narrow channeling of impulse and energy. But everyone belongs to everyone else, he concluded, citing the hypnopathic proverb. All right, so that's a nice one. But everyone belongs to everyone else, it says here. That's called altruism, and it's a very destructive philosophy. It's a very egoistic philosophy also. Altruism, right? Well, I can hear people saying, now, how can you call that an egoistic philosophy? I'll tell you why. Altruism is the idea that you should sacrifice yourself for others. So, who the fuck are you telling me to sacrifice myself for somebody else? Right? That's what I mean with egoistic. It's a very destructive and negative philosophy, this altruism. The students nodded, emphatically agreeing with the statement which upwards of 62,000 repetitions in the dark had made them accept, not merely as true, but as axiomatic, self-evident, utterly indisputable. But after all, Lenina was protesting. It's only about 4 months now since I've been having Henry. Only 4 months? I like that. And what's more, Fanny went on, pointing an accusing finger, there's nobody else except Henry at the time. Has there? Lenina blushed scarlet, but her eyes, the tone of her voice, remained defiant. No, there hasn't been anyone else, she answered almost. I can't read that word. And I jolly well don't see why there should have been. Oh, she jolly well doesn't see why there should have been, Fanny repeated, as though to an invisible listener behind Lenina's left shoulder. Then, with a sudden change of tone, but seriously, she said, I really do think you ought to be careful. It's such horrible bad form to go on and on like this with one man. At 40 or 35 it wouldn't be so bad, but at your age, Lenina, no, it really won't do. And you know how strong the DHC objects to anything intense or long drawn. 4 months of Henry Foster without having another man, why, he'd be furious if he knew. Think of water under pressure in a pipe. They thought of it. I pierced it once, said the controller. What a jet! He pierced it 20 times. There were 20 piddling little fountains. My baby, my baby! Mother! The madness is infectious. My love, my one and only, precious. Precious. Yeah. Mother, monogamy, romance. High spurts the fountain, fierce and foamy the wild jet. The urge has but a single outlet. My love, my baby. No wonder these poor pre-moderns were mad and wicked and miserable. Their world didn't allow them to take things easily, didn't allow them to be sane, virtuous, happy. With what? Not with what? What with mothers and lovers? What with the prohibitions they were not conditioned to obey? What with the temptations and the lonely remorses? What with all the diseases and the endless isolating pain? What with the uncertainties and the poverty? They were forced to feel strongly. And feeling strongly, what was more, in solitude, in hopelessly individual isolation, how could they be stable? Of course, there's no need to give him up. Have somebody else from time to time, that's all. He has other girls, doesn't he? Lenina admitted it. Of course he does. Trust Henry Foster to be the perfect gentleman, always correct. And then there's the director to think of. You know, what a stickler. Nodding. He patted me on the behind this afternoon, said Lenina. There, you see? Fanny was triumphant. That shows what he stands for. The strictest conventionality. Yeah. Jup. Stability, said the controller. Stability. No civilization without stability. No social stability without individual stability. His voice was a trumpet. Listening, they felt larger, warmer. The machine turns and must keep on turning forever. It is death if it stands still. 1,000 millions scrabbled the crust of the earth. The wheels began to turn. In 150 years there were 2,000 millions. Stop all the wheels. In 150 weeks there are once more only 1,000 millions. 1,000 men and women have starved to death. Wheels must turn steadily, but cannot turn untended. There must be men to tend them, men as steady as the wheels upon their axles, sane men, obedient men, stable in contentment. Yeah. So, I'm just gonna sneak in a little comment here. This way of thinking that we've been presented with so far, reading this chapter 3 and 2 also, is reflective of reality as it is. And I'll give you an example. The education of people, and I don't mean the few, you know, I'm talking about lots of people, began about a couple of generations before people were working in factories. So we're talking a pre-industrial revolution. And they were teaching or educating, I would say, I shouldn't use actually those words. They were schooling, which is the better word. Definition for schooling, just off the top of my head, I would have to, you know, do this from scratch actually. Definition for schooling would be conformity, uniformity, and obedience, destruction of continuity. I don't know if that's true, but it's the fact that after so many minutes the school bell rings, and no matter what you do, you just got to drop it and go to the next lesson, right? And so that's destructive. It doesn't teach children to finish what they were doing, right? And so, you know, schooling is just there to prepare human resources for the predestined work in society, right? And so this began, this mass education began a couple of generations, maybe 3 or 4, before the Industrial Revolution. And so, these people, they think ahead long time. Right? It's not that it was all of a sudden the masses of people rose up and said, we need education. Right? It didn't happen like that. This was, quote unquote, given to us. And it works like indoctrination, like a conditioning. Right? Richard Grove says literacy is slavery until you do the research, something like that. Maybe if I doubt we will get him on because he's really too busy. But he did say that he was going to, but no luck. Right, so what the gist that we get from what we've read so far is that the control of masses of people, it's thousands of years old. All right, so let's continue. Crying, my baby, my mother, my only love groaning. My sin, my terrible God, screaming with pain, muttering with fever, bemoaning old age and poverty. How can they tend to the wheels? And if they cannot tend the wheels, the corpses of thousands and thousands of men and women would be hard to bury or burn. And after all, Fanny's tone was coaxing. It's not as though there were anything painful or disagreeable about having 1 or 2 men besides Henry, and seeing that you ought to be a little more promiscuous. Stability, insisted the controller. Stability, the primal and ultimate need. Stability, hence all this. With a wave of his hand he indicated the gardens, the huge buildings of the conditioning center, the naked children furtively in their undergrowth or running across the lawns. Lenina shook her head. Somehow, she mused, I hadn't been feeling very keen on promiscuity lately. There are times when one doesn't. Haven't you found that too, Fanny? Fanny nodded her sympathy and understanding. But one's got to make the effort, she said sententiously. One's got to play the game. After all, everyone belongs to everyone else. Yes, everyone belongs to everyone else, Lenina repeated slowly. And you can already tell that it's a slogan. And, sighing, was silent for a moment. You can tell that it's a slogan. That was my interjection there. Then, taking Fanny's hand, gave a little squeeze. You're quite right, Fanny. As usual, I'll make the effort. Impulse arrested spills over. And the flood is feeling. The flood is passion. The flood is even madness. It depends on the force of the current, the height and strength of the barrier. The unchecked stream flows smoothly down its appointed channels into a calm well-being. The embryo is hungry, day in, day out. The blood surrogate pump unceasingly turns its 800 revolutions a minute. The decanted infant howls. At once a nurse appears with a bottle of external secretion. Feeling lurks, in that interval of time between desire and its consummation. Shorten that interval, break down all those old unnecessary barriers. Fortunate boys, said the controller. No pains have been spared to make your lives emotionally easy to preserve you, so far as that is possible, from having emotions at all. Ford's in his flivver, murmured the DHC, all's well with the world. Lenina Crown, said Henry Foster, echoing the assistant predestinator's question as he zipped up his trousers. Oh, she's a splendid girl, wonderfully pneumatic. I'm surprised you haven't had her. I can't think how it is I haven't, said the assistant predestinator. I certainly will at the first opportunity. From his place on the opposite side of the changing room aisle, Bernard Marx overheard what they were saying and turned pale. And to tell the truth, said Lenina, I'm beginning to get just a little tiny bit bored with nothing but Henry every day. She pulled on her left stocking. Do you know Bernard Marx? She asked in a tone whose excessive casualness was evidently forced. Fanny looked startled. You don't mean to say... Why not? Bernard's an alpha plus. Bernard's an alpha plus. Besides, he asked me to go to one of the Savage reservations with him. I've always wanted to see a Savage reservation. But his reputation? What do I care about his reputation? They say he doesn't like obstacle golf. They say, mocked Lenina. And then he spends most of his time by himself, alone. There was horror in Fanny's voice. Well, he won't be alone when he's with me, and anyhow, why are people so beastly to him? I think he's rather sweet. She smiled to herself. How absurdly shy he had been. Frightened, almost, as though she were a world controller and he had a gamma-minus machine minder. Consider your own lives, said Mustafa Mond. Has any of you ever encountered an insurmountable obstacle? The question was answered by a negative silence. Has any of you been compelled to live through a long time interval between the consciousness of a desire and its fulfillment? Well, began one of the boys, and hesitated. Speak up, said the DHC. Don't keep his fortship waiting. I once had to wait nearly 4 weeks before a girl I wanted would let me have her. And you feel a strong emotion in consequence? Horrible. Horrible, precisely, said the controller. Our ancestors were so stupid and short-sighted that when the first reformers came along and offered to deliver them from those horrible emotions, they wouldn't have anything to do with them. Talking about her as though she were a bit of meat. Bernard ground his teeth. Have her here, like mutton, degrading her to so much mutton. She said she'd think it over. She said she'd give me an answer this week. Oh, Ford, he would have liked to go up to them and hit them in the face hard. Yes, I really advise you, try her, Henry Foster was saying. Take ectogenesis, Fitzner and Kawaguchi had got the whole technique worked out. But would the government look at it? No. There was something called Christianity. Women were forced to go on being viviparous. "He's so ugly," said Fanny, "but I rather like his looks." "And then so small." Fanny made a grimace. Smallness was so horrible and typically low cost. "I think that's rather sweet," said Lenina. "One feels one would like to pet him, like a cat." Fanny was shocked. "They say somebody made a mistake when he was still in the bottle, thought he was a gamma and put alcohol in his blood surrogate. That's why he's so stunted." "What nonsense!" Lenina was indignant. Sleep teaching was actually prohibited in England. There was something called liberalism. Parliament, if you know what that was, passed a law against it. The records survive. Speeches about liberty of the subject. Liberty to be inefficient and miserable. Freedom to be a round peg in a square hole. "But my dear chap, you're welcome, I assure you, you're welcome." Henry Foster patted the assistant predestinator on the shoulder. Everyone belongs to everyone else, after all. 100 repetitions, 3 nights a week for 4 years, thought Bernard Marx, who was a specialist on hypnopedia. 62,400 repetitions make one truth. Idiots. Or the caste system, constantly proposed, constantly rejected. There was something called democracy, as though men were more than physico-chemically equal. Well, all I can say is that I'm going to accept this invitation. Bernard hated them, but they were two, they were large, they were strong. The 9 Years' War began in Anno Fort 141. Not even if they were true about the alcohol in his blood surrogate. Phosgene, chloropicrin, ethyl iodocetate, difluncyanarcine, trichloremethyl, chloroformate, dichloreltyl sulfate, not to mention hydroxynate acid. Well, I simply don't believe, Lenina concluded. The noise of 14,000 aeroplanes advancing in open border. But in Kurfürstendamm and the 8th arrondissement, the explosion of the anthrax bombs is hardly louder than the popping of a paper bag. Because I do want to see a savage reservation. And then it gives here a chemical description of a chemical substance. CH3, C6H2, NO2, 3, plus HgCNO2 is, well, what? An enormous hole in the ground, a pile of masonry, some bits of flesh and mucus, a foot, with the blood still on it, flying through the air and landing, flop, in the middle of the geraniums, the scarlet ones, such a splendid show that summer. You're hopeless, Lenina. I give you up. The Russian technique for infecting water supplies was particularly ingenious. Back turned to back, Fanny and Lenina continued their changing in silence. The 9 Years' War, the great economic collapse. there was a choice between world control and destruction, between stability and... Fanny Crown's a nice girl too, said the assistant predestinator. In the nurseries, the elementary class consciousness lesson was over. The voices were adapting future demand to future industrial supply. I do love flying, they whispered. I do love flying. I do love having new clothes. I do love... Liberalism, of course, was dead of anthrax, but all the same you couldn't do things by force. Not nearly so pneumatic as Lenina. Oh, not nearly. Alright, so he's throwing like how many discussions all through each other here now. Not that I have a problem with it, but I can imagine that it's kind of confusing. But old clothes are beastly, continued the untiring whisper. We always throw away old clothes. Ending is better than mending. Ending is better than mending. Government's an affair of sitting, not hitting. You rule with the brains and the buttocks, not with the fists. For example, there was the conscription of consumption. There, I'm ready, said Lenina. But Fanny remained speechless and averted. Let's make peace, Fanny darling. Every man, woman and child compelled to consume so much a year, in the interest of industry, the sole result. Ending is better than mending. The more stitches, the less riches. The more stitches... One of these days, said Fanny with dismal emphasis, you'll get into trouble. Conscientious objection on an enormous scale. Anything not to consume, back to nature. I do love flying, I do love flying. Back to culture. Yes, actually to culture. You can't consume much if you sit still and read books. Do I look all right? Lenina asked. Her jacket was made of bottle green acetate cloth with green viscose fur at the cuffs and collar. 800 simple lifers were mowed down by machine guns at Golders Green. Ending is better than mending. Green corduroy shorts and white viscose woolen stockings turned down below the knee. Then came the famous British Museum massacre. 2,000 culture fans gassed with dichlorethyl sulfide. A green and white jockey cap shaded Lenina's eyes. Her shoes were bright green and highly polished. In the end, said Mustafa Mond, the controllers realized that force was no good. The slower but infinitely surer methods of ectogenesis, neo-Pavlovian conditioning, and hypnopedia. Around and round her waist she wore a silver-mounted green Morocco surrogate cartridge belt, bulging, for Lenina was not a free martin, with the regulation supply of contraceptives. The discoveries of Pfitzner and Kawaguchi were at least made use of, as intensive propaganda against viviparous reproduction. Hold on, guys. Perfect, cried Fanny enthusiastically. She could never resist Lenina's charm for long. And what a perfectly sweet Malthusian belt. Accompanied by a campaign against the past, by the closing of museums, the blowing up of historical monuments, luckily most of them had already been destroyed during the 9 Years' Wars, by the suppression of all books published before Anno Fort 150. I simply must get one like it, said Fanny. There were some things called pyramids, for example. My old black patent bandolier. And a man called Shakespeare. You've never heard of them, of course. It's an absolute disgrace, that bandolier of mine. Such are the advantages of a really scientific education. The more stitches, the less riches. The introduction of our Ford's first T model. I've had it nearly 3 months. Chosen as the opening date of the new era. Ending is better than mending. There was a thing, as I've said before, called Christianity. Ending is better than mending. The ethics and philosophy of underconsumption. Yeah. Alright, so the ethics and philosophy of underconsumption. I'm gonna give you guys a warning ahead of time. I think I'm right in my assessment so far. If there's this, well, I don't know what it is, let's just call it a non-governmental organization. It's the Schumacher Center for New Economics. And they have lectures and publications. And one of them is the Lindisfarne tapes. And I've listened to a couple of those, and they are very dangerous. These people are very, very dangerous in what they are promoting here. It's planetary culture and the new image of humanity, industrialization and the emergence of the modern world, conscience evolution and the evolution of consciousness, exploration of the esoteric interface, and all of this kind of stuff. Planetary culture and the new image of humanity. That they are talking about things you see back in society today, and this is from 1975, these tapes. And they are totally off on mysticism. It's fracking unbelievable. And these are like regard these speakers. There's a whole list of them. Evelyn Ames, Jose Arguillas, Louis Balamuth, Thomas Banyanka, Richard Barnett. All these people are supposedly held in high esteem, right? There's people coming to hear these people speak. These are professors and such. And they are traitors to humanity. I've heard these people say that we should live in poverty. I'm quoting him with the word poverty when he's talking about economic reforms and industrialization and things like that. And this is 1975, and they were pushing the UN Agenda 21 with a mystical philosophy. And it's really dangerous stuff. I compare this to the Esalen Institute. Also, these guys are part of the culture creators. So watch it. If you ever, go to this Schumacher Center for New Economics, or if people refer you to that, it's a new age den of evil. Right? Then that's what came to my mind when it said here in Brave New World, the ethics and philosophy of underconsumption. Reminds me of, I don't remember his name, and I don't remember the website either, but he has been on Corbett's report a couple of times. He knows all about technocracy, and it's ruled by experts, but also a new economic system. This technocracy. All right, so where were we? I love new clothes. I love new clothes. So essential when there was an underproduction. But in an age of machines and the fixation of nitrogen, positively a crime against society. Yeah, and here's another thing, right? In the age of machines, right? We were making machines generations ago. And now we even have machines making machines, right? So why are we still working our asses off? You know, it's insane. It really is. With the technology that we have today, it should be possible for everybody to work 1 day a week, maximum. That should be enough. You know, we have machines. We can let the machines do the work. And I don't mean then major corporations dumping the workforce and getting robots instead of them. It doesn't, that's not useful for us. You know, it's not workable in the situation that we have today, right? But just plainly, without the taking in regard the system as it is, the technology is there to give us all leisure time. Everybody. Just it's the same as nobody needs to be hungry, which is true, right? Doesn't mean that it actually manifests itself. Mm-mm. 58. It's time to call it for today, guys. Thanks everybody in the chat. Captain Gringo, Captain Cracker, Dale, not Captain Cracker, but anyway.
The very word
Dale, Hopper, Joe, Juana, Meticlus, Otto.
Inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings.
Surely you jest. And to an
the
all,
New World Order
thanks for
is
listening,
emerging.
everybody. I'll be back next week. Bye-bye.
An inside job? How dare you? How dare you?
To create, so to say, mass-produced models of human beings arranged in some
The Anti-Media Radio, your host Nick Burnaby here on UCY.